Well, hello. Video about lost atomic and nuclear weapons. Hope you are sitting comfortably. Are you sitting comfortably, Glacier? Okay, no. Oh, and spoiler alert. Rest assured that most of these have been destroyed or recovered, but not all of them. But don't worry about that. We're pretty certain where the rest of them are. Mostly, and they are where people can't get at them without a lot of effort. Most of these are American. There are many reasons for that, but one is that the Americans have a demonstrated commitment to more open government and publicly admitting their errors. So I'm going to give them some credit for that, because no one else would do it. The British would classify it, remind everyone involved that they signed the Official Secrets Act, and that would actually work. We'll get to that later. The French would do something similar and probably also kill anyone who looked like they might tell. The Israelis sidestep this issue by not admitting they have any in the first place. But if they did lose one, there is about a 73% chance they'd resolve it with no issue, and a 27% chance they'd kill another Oslo waiter by mistake. The Russians would publicly admit to nothing, and write a very detailed report that would then be so highly restricted it would be forgotten about. It would end up discovered decades later by Western researchers during a brief window when their archives were open. They managed to do that with Operation Mars, and they lost 180,000 troops doing that. You see, the Vatican have this right, because in order to request a document from their archives, you have to know it exists. And they don't have an index, so you can't just poke around looking for shady stuff. Though so far as we are aware, the papacy has never lost a nuclear weapon nor shown interest in acquiring any. They think they have a hotline to the big girl upstairs. It would seem a little bit unnecessary. So in general, the only nuclear weapons losses we know about for the Soviets are the ones it was impossible to conceal. And that usually means a very big mess was involved. For the Chinese, well, we'll get to them. So yeah, America in this instance is like Florida. You know, it's like how Florida has a reputation for being weird. It's not because Florida is weird, it just has way more open laws about what gets reported. And really, really bad mental health care. It is quite possible that Florida is not weirder than the rest of the United States, may well be the scariest thing you take away from a video about lost nuclear weapons. And that at any moment there may be somebody robbing a Burger King dressed as pantsless Ronald McDonald. But you don't hear about it because it is in Nebraska. And instead of throwing a baby alligator in through the drive-thru window, he has to substitute with a pig or a close relative in a fursuit. Anyway, it took 4.5 years for the first nuclear weapons to get lost. As for the first couple of years, they didn't really have that many, and the Atomic Energy Commission kept a very tight hold over them. But by 1950, the US had about 235, and the USSR had maybe 2, possibly called Boris and Natasha. Strategic Air Command finally got permission to use them in training, albeit without the nuclear core needed for them to detonate. We'll come to that a bit later. So, in February of that year, a B-36 was on a training exercise simulating an attack on San Francisco. Yes, thank you, Cat. I can't move. Are you purring now, are you? I wonder if that gets picked up on the microphone along with the diesel engine next door. Yes, anyway. Now, the B-36 was a quite remarkable aircraft, as much in advance over the B-29 as the B-29 was over the B-72, and yet simultaneously near obsolescent when it came into service. It was one of the very last bombers conceived according to the higher, faster and better armed paradigm that had dominated bomber design since bombers were first a thing. Okay, maybe not fast exactly, because the thing cruised at a stately 230 miles per hour. On the other hand, it would do so comfortably at 40,000 feet or more, where the next fastest thing would be a weather balloon, so nothing could yet touch it, barring some short-run World War II projects that never really went anywhere very much. And just to be sure, the thing carried 16 20mm cannon as a subtle hint to leave well alone. Greta Garbo should have tried that, and it was the only aircraft the US Air Force had with the range and payload to deliver nuclear bombs to the USSR from the continental United States without air-to-air refueling, as early jets were too thirsty and not in a good way. Such missions could take 40 hours, which was why they put a galley and 6 bunks in the thing. Unfortunately, one of the ways it achieves its heightened range was by mounting its props in a pusher configuration at the back of the wing. This gave a very nice clear airflow over the wing, hence that very nice altitude performance, but the R3460 Watt Major engines it used were designed for a conventional tractor application, where the carburetor, which is where air comes in and gets mixed with fuel, would be warmed by the heat of the engine. In a pusher configuration, that didn't happen, so the B-36 suffered quite badly from having its carburetors ice up, causing a reduction in airflow and therefore power because there was not enough air to burn all the fuel. This was pretty bad. What was worse was that when the fuel did make it out of the engine, it was now hot and surrounded by plenty of air and had a tendency to catch fire in the exhaust. It is pretty cold at altitude anyway, but in order to reach the USSR, even the B-36 had to be based in the northern United States and Alaska, which didn't exactly help. So, February over the Inside Passage, this B-36 that was pretending to be attacking at San Francisco developed engine trouble from icing. The sort of severe engine trouble where 3 of your engines lose power and the other 3 catch fire. To prevent any possibility of the bomb's design being compromised, the crew jettisoned the bomb, which exploded conventionally, and then bailed out. 12 out of the 17 survived. The crashed bomber was found 3 years later. No part of the bomb has ever been recovered. April 1950. A B-29 crashed and burned 3 minutes after takeoff from Kirtland Air Force Base in New Mexico. All 13 aboard were killed. The bomb's conventional explosives detonated in the fire. A nuclear core was in the aircraft, but not inserted for safety reasons. July 1950. A B-50, which was just a badly engineered B-29 to persuade Congress they were approving funding for a new type of plane, nosed into the ground from 7,000 feet near Lebanon, Ohio. All 16 aboard were killed. No nuclear core was aboard, but the conventional explosives detonated on impact. August 1950. The Korean War had broken out, and as a precaution, 10 Saddletree, i.e. nuclear capable, B-29s were sent to Guam with weapons aboard, but without core. Shortly before liftoff from Fairfield Suisun Air Force Base, one propeller went into overspeed and had to be feathered. The plane struggled into the air, but another prop developed the same problem and the landing gear would not retract. After attempting a 180-degree turn for emergency landing, the plane swerved to avoid a nearby trailer park and hit the ground. 12 of the 20 aboard were killed, including Brigadier General Robert Travis. After initial evacuation, the senior officer on the ground ordered onlookers and firefighters to pull back and let the plane burn. He was mostly ignored, and shortly afterwards the explosives detonated. This blew a 6-foot deep and 60-foot wide crater and scattered burning fuel and debris over a 2-square-mile area. Another 7 people were killed in the blast and 173 wounded, with 2 amputations. A year later, the base was renamed after Travis. At the same time, my dog really wanted pets. Here you go, picture of dog. Yes, I know, you beautiful. Okay? Yes, you lovely. At the same time, a similar and extremely secret deployment was made to Goose Bay, Labrador. In November 1950, a B-50 returning from this mission developed severe engine trouble and jettisoned its weapon over the 6-mile wide St. Lawrence, near Rivière-du-Loup in Quebec, setting it to detonate in the self-destruct at 2,500 feet. This its duty did, waking local residents who would later be told it was a conventional bomb. Fortunately, after this, there are not any more incidents till 1956, so I'll take the opportunity to explain a little bit how these things work. So I guess I have to explain how a nuclear action happens. What happens is an atom is hit by a subatomic particle called a neutron, and it splits into 2 or more smaller bits, and it loses a tiny bit of mass. That is converted into energy because E equals mc squared, and c is the speed of light, and light goes really, really fast, so c is huge, and c is huge squared, like your mum. This is how the 64 kilos of uranium in Little Boy that was dropped on Hiroshima produced an explosion you'd need 15,000 tons of TNT to match. This process also releases more neutrons that in turn can hit other atoms and split them up in what they call a chain reaction. For this, you need enough of the atoms in question close enough together that the neutrons produced in one split cause 1 or more collisions and splits themselves. In a power plant, the purity of the material is quite low and things are set up that you only get a self-sustaining reaction. Usually. You can't get a bomb-like effect from a reactor, but you can make a real big mess. A bomb uses much more concentrated material, so that each split will cause multiple new splits in a runaway reaction very, very quickly. Should mention at this point that the atoms that are easy to split up are radioactive themselves and continually breaking apart into 8 slightly smaller bits and giving off neutrons. Normally, there is not enough of them to get a sustainable reaction. However, if there is what is called the critical mass, the spontaneously produced neutrons will find targets and you'll get a chain reaction. 2 30-kilo balls of uranium-235. Bring them together and a 60-kilo mass can detonate, depending on shape, purity, presence and absence of effectors and initiators that I'm not going to go into here. Atomic weapons design is therefore an exercise in keeping your mass subcritical and then making it critical when you want it to go off, and only then. And to do that, you've got to do it quite quickly so that it doesn't blow apart before it's properly detonated. That is called a fizzle, and it's still dangerous and destructive because several thousand tons of TNT equivalent is not something you want to be near of when it sort of explodes. The simplest way to do that is to take 2 subcritical masses and shoot one at the other in what is known as a gun-type weapon because it is a type of weapon that is a gun. This has the great advantage of being extremely simple. It was so simple, in fact, that Little Boy, the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, wasn't even tested first. They were so confident it would work. This has the great disadvantage of being extremely simple. You two are extremely simple. It's a bit too easy to set off by accident because you only need 1 or 2 explosions, and that's quite possible if the plane is on fire. In any case, you are violently propelling 2 subcritical masses together, like say what might happen if the aircraft carrying it crashes, or is attacked by a giant shark or a giant dog. You alright there? Yes, good, fine. Oh! Are you hogging the camera, Glacier? An important consideration in weapons design is that it go off when you want it to. An often overlooked other consideration, and often a lot harder to do, is that it not go off when you do not want it to. There may be an other consideration, but we have top men working to discover what it is. You drop a Sten gun, and if that goes off, that's bad for anyone in the immediate area. You drop an atomic bomb and it goes off, that's also bad for anyone in the immediate area. It's just that the immediate area is a bit bigger. It has the other disadvantage of being very inefficient in its use of fuel, and the only fuel you can use is purified, or in the technical lingo enriched, uranium-235. This is the main fissile form of uranium, but makes up less than 1% of natural uranium, which is mostly uranium-238. They are both uranium, so they are chemically identical. So the only way you can separate them is by various physical methods, all of which share the property of being colossal pains in the derriere to have to do. Imagine sorting through a haystack-sized pile of needles, looking for the ones that are less than 1% smaller than the others, and make up less than 1% of the total. And you are blindfolded and wearing oven mitts. What you can also do is slightly purify your uranium and run it in a reactor to produce plutonium. And separating that out is a chemical process which is comparatively fairly simple. It just happens to involve the chemistry of a metal that ignites in air, is both radioactive and mundanely toxic, and will accumulate in your bones given the opportunity. It might have other endearing qualities I'm forgetting about for now, but you get the general idea. However, you can't achieve critical mass with a gun-type weapon using plutonium, because you need an unfeasibly long gun to get the speed necessary to get a proper explosion and not a fizzle. You could build one, but it probably wouldn't be a practical weapon you could really deliver anywhere. What instead you have to do is to compress the plutonium down by setting off very precise explosions all around it. This is an engineering problem that needs precisely crafted explosive lenses and very precise fuses to make them go off precisely when you want them to, and some exotic materials that have been precisely machined. And I'm going to say precise again in case you didn't get the point. Because it's a more complex design, the plutonium bomb was tested before it was used and was the Fat Man bomb dropped on Nagasaki. It does, however, have the advantage of being inherently a lot safer than a gun-type weapon, because everything has to work exactly for it to go off. So if one detonator or explosive cooks off in a fire, it cannot result in a nuclear explosion, and if damaged in a crash, it fails safe. Well, safer, Just because you cannot get a nuclear explosion does not mean you cannot have a conventional one. That will also happen to scatter plutonium everywhere. And also these designs tend to include depleted uranium in them as well for its other properties, which is the 99% of your haystack of uranium left over after you have picked as much of the U-238 out of it as you can with your oven mitts, and sufficiently inert to have non-blowing things up applications. It is still toxic and mildly radioactive, but nowhere near as bad as plutonium or native uranium. Now, the 4 incidents mentioned so far all involve the Mark IV atomic bomb, which refined the Fat Man design into a practical weapon rather than a finicky but lethal curiosity. This contained 5,000 pounds of high explosive, weighed over twice that, and was over 10 feet long and 5 feet in diameter. It also had a very elementary but extremely workable security and safety system. The plutonium core you needed for atomic detonation was removable, and in an operational flight it was a crew member's job to insert it shortly before dropping it. For training, they would fly without one and use a dummy. This also meant that the civilian leadership could deploy the bulky bombs to a distant base, but keep tight control over the much lighter and more valuable cores and fly them out in a hurry if you wanted to use them. Now, by later standards, that would be a completely inadequate response time, but this was the 1950s when if nuclear war happened, it was going to be a lot slower. Not least because your delivery system is the B-36 that will take most of the day to get to its target, but also because thinking was still in a World War II era mindset where you destroy cities one by one, and the atomic weapons to hand were not appreciably more destructive than conventional bombing had been in World War II, just more efficient. It wasn't until missiles replaced bombers as the main delivery system in the 70s and 80s that you can go full Judgment Day mode, where if civilization isn't destroyed in 30 minutes or less, the Armageddon is on us. It does, however, mean that the civilian leadership has control of the weapons. This was especially important given that in early 1951, President Truman would sack Douglas MacArthur from his command of the UN forces in Korea for a variety of complicated and still debated reasons, up to and including possibly wanting to nuke the Chinese. They did release 9 atomic cores to the military, but they made sure to give them to Strategic Air Command, who did not answer to MacArthur. It meant they answered to Curtis LeMay instead, the guy who managed to inspire Dr. Strangelove's General Ripper and General Turkison, who are both crazy, but in very, very different ways, and would later be the running mate of segregationist presidential candidate George Wallace. So, not exactly a hippie, but someone who could be trusted to not start World War III unless ordered to. Or the Russians told him to put out his cigar. Still, if I'm one of the many, many presidents he worked under, I'm going to want a daily briefing on how he feels about his precious bodily fluids, and possibly employ a team of people whose only job it is to make sure he stays hydrated. Anyway, it became clear in the Korean War that the piston-engined B-29, B-36, and totally not a B-29, B-50 were too vulnerable to newer jet fighters. They tried to enhance the B-36 by stripping the 8 twin 20mm turrets down to just 2, and supplemented the 6 piston engines with 4 jets to get it even higher and a little bit faster. They also stripped out most of the crew comforts from the rear lounge, in case you were thinking it was just commercial aviation that suffered from those pressures. Presumably this was replaced with a multi-pack of Capri Sun and an empty bottle we had to pass around between them. The new bomber was the B-47 Stratojet, which was a sleek jet with a crew of only 3 and only 1 gun turret. It did, however, require either forward air basing or air-to-air refueling to get to the Soviet Union. And the first place they forward deployed nuclear weapons and cores to was Morocco, apparently without telling the French, who were running the place at the time, or after independence the Moroccans. It is possible that this was the origin of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Then, soon after, Britain and several other NATO countries, Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, South Korea. In March 1956, a B-57 was in transit to an undisclosed foreign airbase, later revealed to be Ben Guir in Morocco, and did not make its rendezvous with a tanker over the Mediterranean. Reports of an aerial explosion near the Moroccan-Algerian border matched the timing, but no trace of the plane, its crew, or the 2 nuclear core aboard has ever been found. July 1956. Another B-47, another undisclosed foreign airbase. The B-47 in question crashed on landing and collided with a storage igloo containing 3 Mark VI atomic bombs, cores, again, not present, and stored separately. One of these was damaged, exposing its detonators. Fortunately, these did not detonate in the resulting conflagration, but all crew perished. Oh yes, And this undisclosed location was RAF Lakenheath in Suffolk, England, a fact which the British suppressed for decades. Reports of this include a panic-stricken exodus of service families from the area. May 1957. A B-36 in an internal ferry flight suffered a malfunction and dropped its bomb through the bomb bay doors. It landed in a field near Albuquerque, New Mexico, and the high explosives detonated. Core was on board, but not inserted. Only casualty was a nearby cow. The weapon in this case was a Mark 17, an early hydrogen bomb. Whilst everything else we've dealt with has been a fission bomb, this was the first fusion weapon to show up on the list. While a fission bomb gains its power by splitting big things apart, big things as atoms go anyway, a fusion bomb gets its power the same way the sun does, by taking small things and fusing them together. This is quite hard to achieve in nature. Jupiter is the biggest planet in the solar system, and it would still need to gain 13 times as much mass in order to start fusion. This is why NASA has a special department whose only job is to make sure your mum gets nowhere near it. Currently, the only way we have of reliably achieving fusion on Earth is by using a fission weapon essentially as a gigantic firestarter. But the hydrogen bomb is what moves nuclear weapons from more efficient ways to achieve the same destruction caused in World War II to screw you. While fission weapons get measured in kilotons, equivalents of thousands of tons of TNT, fusion bombs go into the megatons, millions of tons of TNT. It is the difference between dropping a fission bomb on Aston and ruining the day of everyone in Birmingham, or dropping a fusion bomb on Birmingham and ruining the day of everyone in the West Midlands. Of course, if they were in Birmingham, their day probably wasn't that great to begin with. July 1957. C-124 transport from Dover Air Force Base suffered engine trouble over the Atlantic, and the crew was obliged to jettison 2 of the 3 bombs aboard. These have never been recovered. October 1957. A B-47 suffered a wheel failure and crashed shortly after takeoff from Homestead Air Force Base, Florida. The bomb aboard was destroyed in the resulting fire, but the uninserted core was recovered more or less intact. January 1958. Another wheel failure, this time at Sidi Slimane in Morocco during a simulated takeoff. A rear tyre failed and the tail struck the runway, rupturing fuel tanks and causing a fire. Fire crews fought the blaze for 10 minutes before evacuating as per procedure. Fire burnt out 7 hours later without detonating the bomb. No fatalities, some contamination. February 1958, Tybee Island, Georgia. B-47 on a training flight was involved in a collision with an F-86 Sabre. The Sabre pilot successfully ejected. The B-47 crew landed successfully after jettisoning the bomb. Despite a thorough search, that bomb has never been found. Reports differ on if a core was aboard. February 1958, RAF Greenham Common. A B-47 developed engine problems on takeoff and jettisoned its prop tanks. These bounced, unfortunately, and hit another B-47 on the ground, setting it on fire. This does not appear on official US lists, quite possibly because both US and UK governments kept it secret until 1985. However, a few years later, a test did find elevated levels of uranium in the surrounding area, and concluded that the 1958 crash was the only incident they knew about that could have caused this, but that didn't mean that it did. And later studies have not replicated that finding, and suggested that the Atomic Weapons Research Establishment at Aldermaston was the origin. Britain is a small place. We have a lot of nuclear stuff in overlapping locations, so it's quite hard to nail who was responsible for what. So this gets flagged as dubious. March 1958. God, it's like 4 this year, and only in Q1. Mars Bluff, South Carolina. Another B-47, this time participating in exercise Snow Flurry, which would have been really on the nose for many other incidents. The idea was to fly to Britain and perform a simulated bomb drop before landing in Morocco. Cores would be aboard, but not inserted. The pilot had a warning light in his cockpit indicating that a locking pin was not engaged, and dispatched Bombardier navigator Bruce Colker to the bomb bay to check it out. Unfortunately, one pulling himself up, he grabbed the emergency release by accident. The bomb dropped, and then forced the bomb bay doors open. Captain Colker's day was not so bad that he followed it out of the plane, but the bomb fell 15,000 feet to the ground, where it detonated, creating a crater 70 feet wide and 35 feet deep, in the process demolishing a playhouse, shifting a family home off its foundations and injuring 4 children and 2 adults. It may well have been worse had it not landed in softer ground. Kolker does not seem to have been blamed for this, given that he served another dozen years in the Air Force with promotion. And the homeowner sued the Air Force and won a settlement. November 1958. Good, not keeping that Q1 performance up. Dyess Air Force Base, Texas. B-47 developed an engine fire and crashed after takeoff. 2 of the crew survived. Weapons HE detonated, destroying the bomb. December 1958. Chenault Air Force Base, Louisiana. Armed B-47 burnt on the ground, destroying a bomb and causing some contamination in the immediate vicinity. January 1959. Pacific Air Base. Bombs were now small enough that planes like the F-100 Super Sabre could carry them. During a practice alert, an F-100's drop tanks were dropped whilst on the tarmac and ignited. The fire was extinguished within 7 minutes. In 2016, this site was revealed to be Osan in South Korea, not counting this one as a loss. July 1959. C-124 Globemaster crashed on takeoff from Barksdale Air Force Base, Louisiana, killing all 7 aboard. 1 or 2 weapons without core burnt down without detonating. September 1959. Puget Sound, Washington. A P-5M Marlin with 1 unarmed depth bomb aboard crashed near Whidbey Island. The bomb was not recovered. Should point out that the P-5 Marlin looks like this. And so, as most flying boats like something which should be carrying 30s adventurers along a red line across a map with things like Nyasaland and Transjordan on it, and not be something that should be hunting subs in the middle of the Cold War. By this time, 3 important developments have started to have an effect. Least significantly, the B-52. Yes, thank you. The B-52. Strategic Air Command has a new bomber that serves to this day, albeit not against anyone in the position to fight back, because for anyone who can, it would be a flying piñata with the life expectancy of the Hindenburg during Chinese New Year, but still an efficient bomb truck for the railing of tons of high explosive death from 40,000 feet or so. However, at this time it is the new frontline bomber, and remains so for the rest of the Cold War. And, like aviation in general, it has advanced from the state of the art in 1950, and things are now generally safer. But as you can guess, not totally safe, or I wouldn't be mentioning it. Secondly, the US has been experimenting with airborne alert, in which rather than sit on the ground and then run to get off when the alarm goes off, like it's 1940, instead you keep some of your bombers armed and in the air at all times. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 and a bit days a year. This starts with operations such as Hide Start, Hardhead, and eventually turned into Chrome Dome, where armed bombers would fly over Alaska, Greenland, and the Mediterranean, waiting for the go-ahead to attack the Soviets, not get it, and then come home. Thirdly, the state-of-art of weapons design had progressed, with more safety interlocks and devices added, and the core permanently inserted into weapons. And there has also been deliberate safety tests of weapons, rather than just designing them a certain way and hoping everything works out okay when a crash happens. The Americans did the first test of this in 1957, but the most infamous examples were carried out by the British. Britain didn't have the space to do this at home, and Ireland was no longer under our control by then. In any case, science in the 19th century had shocked educated opinion by revealing that the Irish were human, and weirdest of all, white, so it wouldn't have been a suitable test space anyway. Fortunately, there was Australia, where the inhabitants are barely sentient, shirtless alcoholics no one will miss. The Aborigines are okay though, but they had zero political power and so got screwed over. As a result, it was in Maralinga, between 1959 and 1961, that the British ran a series of 43 tests to examine the safety of their weapons by simulating what would happen to them in an aircraft crash. This included burning them in petrol and deliberately blowing them up with an adjacent explosion. It worked. They did sometimes go off, but if you did get a nuclear explosion, it was less powerful than the conventional explosive elements of the bomb. This was therefore counted as a win. I quote, "These trials involved negligible fission yield, but produced jets of molten burning plutonium extending hundreds of feet into the air." Somewhere in the MOD there is footage of that, and I want to live long enough for it to be released. If I'm still doing this by then, I am not going to release any videos the day that hits trending. Also, remember this next time someone asks you what your dream job would be during an interview. Now, doing this, as you might imagine, made a huge mess, and in fact safety tests have left behind way more contamination than actual weapons tests themselves. We get to know all this because it's caught up in the complex relationship between the British government, post-colonial Australian government, and the rights, or lack thereof, of its indigenous inhabitants. Hence, open publication. This sort of thing otherwise tends to be kept under wraps in order to keep people who want to develop nuclear weapons at least partially occupied with trying not to kill themselves. But once they have done so, it's not unknown for nations like the US to step in and share knowledge to make them safer, and offer assistance in development of permissive action links so they stay under the control of the people who are supposed to be under control. And if you're Pakistan, you reject this offer because you don't trust the Americans to not build a backdoor into your own command and control. So, come the early 60s, the US have planes in the air all the time carrying armed weapons, but the weapons and the planes have gotten a lot safer. October 1959, Hardinsburg, Kentucky. A B-52 with 2 weapons aboard collided with a KC-135 air tanker. All 4 of the tanker crew and 4 of the 8 aboard the B-52 were killed. 1 bomb burnt, but both were ultimately recovered. June 1960. McGuire Air Force Base, New Jersey. First missile accident. Now, missiles have a fairly good safety record in this regard because they don't go anywhere or do anything until they are actually used. This particular one was not an offensive missile, but a defensive long-range surface-to-air missile called Bomark, which doesn't mean anything sinister, but it should. It's Boeing plus Michigan Airspace Research Center. Presumably, they were big rivals of Lockheed Ohio State Engineering Research and Science. Also, the Air Force, for reasons at least partially to do with inter-service lap fighting with the Army over who got to be in control of it, initially gave it a fighter designation of F-99 on the ground, but it was really a pilotless aircraft to shoot down bombers. The short that flies once on a one-way trip to the target and then explodes, which is not the same thing as a missile because reasons. However, this was the early Cold War days of rocketry, and that means volatile and voxeless liquid propellants. In this case, hydrazine, which is not a fan publication about Marvel villains, but a nitrogen-hydrogen compound. Well, specifically, unsymmetrical dimethylhydrazine, UDMH, which is a fanzine where someone screwed up so the pages are not the same size. Also, someone has added 2 methyl groups to it. And IRFNA, which is not a dissident Irish Republican splinter group, not yet anyway, but inhibited red fuming nitric acid. The inhibited bit doesn't mean it's uptight and British, but rather that it has had an agent added to it so it doesn't dissolve the tank you put it in. That agent is sometimes hydrogen fluoride, being one of the very few circumstances where adding HF to a situation actually improves matters. Anyway, red fuming nitric acid. That's not hiding behind complex nomenclature, that's a name that says do not mess around with that stuff. It is perhaps my second favourite, very much on-the-nose chemical name. My favourite is FOOF, which is the chemical structure of dioxygen difluoride, and also onomatopoeia for what it will do on contact with basically anything. And these things were tipped with a 10-kiloton nuclear warhead to knock Soviet bombers out of the sky. The Bomark had been in service for less than a year when the helium tank on one exploded. I'm presuming the helium, which is otherwise about as inert a substance as you can get, was there to pressurize the system, but I've not been able to verify that. This caused a significant fire that was suppressed with 30,000 gallons of water. Unfortunately, the water dispersed and diluted the warhead fragments, causing the loss of 300 grams of plutonium. The USF cordoned the place off, painted, tarmacked and concreted over things, shipped away some contaminated dirt and removed the contaminated launcher, but later admitted they had forgotten exactly what they had done with it. The site remains off limits and under monitoring. January 1961, Goldsboro, North Carolina. A B-52 developed a severe leak and lost 17 tons of fuel in 3 minutes. The starboard wing failed when the crew deployed flaps during the descent, and they attempted to exit the aircraft at 9,000 feet. 6 of them made it out, but only 5 survived, another 2 dying in the crash. The plane was carrying 2 3.8 megaton Mark 39 bombers, which parted company with the disintegrating aircraft at around 1,500 feet. One landed safely by parachute in a tree, having gone through at least some of the steps necessary to arm itself, though sources disagree how close it came to going off. The other slammed into a muddy field near Nahunta Swamp and largely disintegrated. The tail was found 20 feet underground, and the core had been dislodged and was recovered. However, after digging down 50 feet, groundwater flooding made further excavation progressively more difficult. So the main body of the bomb has not been recovered and is estimated to lie about 180 feet down. The Air Force decided it was not worth the effort and just bought an easement saying no one is allowed to dig deeper than 5 feet there. Presumably they do monitor this rather than wait for someone to dig it up and then sue them. You'll need to do some serious Oak Island style work to even have a shot at it, so I think someone would notice you trying. March 1961, Yuba City, California. A B-52 with 2 weapons aboard began experiencing excessive hot air blowing into the cockpit within 20 minutes of takeoff. They did press on with their mission, but after 14 hours the cockpit temperature has reached what was later estimated as at least 50 and possibly up to 70 degrees Celsius. At this point, one of the cockpit windows shattered at 33,500 feet. They tried to maintain altitude for another 20 minutes or so, but were forced to descend to 12,000. Fuel consumption was a lot higher at low level, not helped by them having to divert around weather systems, and they had a malfunctioning fuel gauge and had been flying for nearly 23 hours at this point. Rendezvous with an air tanker failed and the aircraft ran out of fuel. After steering it onto a safe course, the crew all successfully and safely got out before it crashed. However, one firefighter on the ground was fatally struck by a motorist. The 4 bombs aboard were recovered despite 2 breaking loose on impact. May 1962, Beale Air Force Base, California. Not very much on this. A liquid oxygen leak culminated in a Titan I intercontinental ballistic missile exploding in its silo. 7 men were hospitalized, but there were no fatalities. This is listed as a nuclear accident in some sources, but I've been able to find out if a warhead was actually present. It is not mentioned on the US list released in the 1980s. There was a tacit moratorium on nuclear testing between the US and USSR that lasted between 1958 and 1961. When the Soviets announced they were going to start again, the US rushed to get some in themselves through the 31 bomb test series, Operation Dominic. Most of these would be B-52 drops, but some involved detonation at high altitude, as in or near space, in order to see what happened. The answer, by the way, is that you destroy a bunch of satellites, screw up electrical equipment in Hawaii, 1,600 miles away, and create some really pretty aurorae. They would use the Thor IRBM for most of these tests. Thor was not a particularly successful weapon system, being developed very rapidly while longer-range missiles were worked on, and its short range required basing in America's allies, very few of whom were willing to host it. Possibly because doing so was going to put you very high on the Soviet targeting list, but also because of its tendency to explode. In the event only the British accepted it. So, these tests would be launched from Johnson Island in the Pacific, which sits away west of Hawaii and southeast of Midway. And from June 1962, 8 Thor launches would be conducted, 4 of which would fail. 2nd of June, Bluegill. The missile appeared to be flying normally, but radar lost track of it. It was remotely destructed as a precaution, and the warhead destroyed. 19th of June, Starfish. Missile flew normally for 59 seconds before the engine shut down and it began to break apart. It was ordered destroyed at around 30,000 feet, and some contaminated debris fell back upon the island and surroundings. Naval personnel spent 2 weeks recovering about 250 pieces, some of them contaminated. July 25th, Bluegill Prime, which, in a textbook example of code words that are intentionally misleading, was the 2nd attempt at the Bluegill mission. A valve in the engine failed on launch, and it was ordered destroyed while still on the pad. Unsurprisingly, this destroyed the launch pad and caused severe contamination which took 3 months to clear up. October 15th, Bluegill Double Prime. Booster failed after 86 seconds. Tumbling rocket was ordered destroyed. More contaminated debris fell on the island. US and USSR would agree the Limited Test Ban Treaty in 1963, banning all above-ground testing. January 1964, Savage Mountain, Maryland. A B-52, returning from a Chrome Dome mission to Europe, lost its vertical stabilizer and rudder due to turbulence in a blizzard as it tried to climb above the weather. 4 of the crew made it out, 1 did not and perished in the crash. Only 2 of those who did get out survived, the other 2 dying of exposure and injuries in the severe winter weather. The 2 bombs were recovered, albeit damaged. December 1964. Ellsworth Air Force Base, South Dakota. A Minuteman I missile was under maintenance when improper use of a screwdriver tripped a fuse, triggering one of the re-entry vehicle retro rockets, dislodging the warhead and causing it to fall to the bottom of the silo. Weapon was disarmed and recovered. December 1964. New plane, the B-58 Hustler. Not a commentary on below-bow literature tastes of US Air Force personnel. This was still a decade before Larry Flint got started. But still, you couldn't call a plane that now. I'm amazed they got away with it at the time, because I don't think hustler meant something different then. For some reason, I'm picturing a very white bunch of Convair engineers, and the US Air Force are very reluctantly going along with this. This was an attempt to return to the really fast bomber types rather than the comparatively lumbering B-52, capable of a Mach 2 dash to the target at 50,000 feet for 500 miles. Amongst other things, it was the first plane to cross the Atlantic supersonic, and it still holds the record for the longest supersonic flight in history, flying from Tokyo to London at an average of 938 miles per hour. It would have been more, but not only did it have to dip below the speed of sound for its 5 refuelings, but it also suffered a malfunctioning afterburner for the last leg. Anyway, during an exercise alert, a B-58 with one bomb aboard skidded off the taxiway. It was icy, but it may also have been hit by the jet blast of the plane in front. However it happened, the landing gear collapsed and it caught fire. 2 of the crew got out. The third ejected, but as the plane was stationary and on the ground, his parachute did not get the chance to fill, and he died on impact. Sources say either 1 or 5 bombs were aboard. December 1965. USS Ticonderoga, Pacific Ocean. An A-4 Skyhawk with a B-43 bomb board rolled off the elevator and was lost with the pilot aboard. When first acknowledged in 1981, this was more than 500 miles from land. This was later revealed to be not true, and the plane was lost 70 miles from one of the Japanese Raikuku Islands. The Japanese, for reasons that I hope are obvious, have very strong opinions about nuclear weapons. Water in that area is 16,000 feet deep, and plane, pilot and weapon have not been recovered, nor located, so far as I can tell. January 1966. Palomares, Spain. Another Chrome Dome mission. Another B-52 colliding with a KC-135 during refueling. The KC-135 ignited, killing all 4 aboard. The B-52 broke up, killing 3 out of 7. It was carrying 4 Mark 28 bombs, 3 of which were accounted for, 1 being found intact, and the other 2 detonating their high explosive on impact and contaminating the local area with plutonium. The 4th could not be found on land and was presumed to have impacted the sea, which local fisherman Simo Orts claimed to have seen. After an 80-day search involving more than 2 dozen Navy ships, the bomb was finally located at 2,500 feet in a submarine canyon, and recovered with some difficulty. The Spanish tourist minister and US ambassador went swimming on local beaches to show everyone they were still safe, and the US shipped 1,400 tons of slightly contaminated soil and tomato plants to the US for handling. Generalissimo Francisco Franco, who was still not dead at the time, took the opportunity to forbid NATO aircraft from flying to or from Gibraltar. This was despite the fact that Gibraltar had nothing to do with it, but he was not going to give up the opportunity to shake his impotent punos in a rage at the Union Jack flying over the rock. More pertinently, Spain also moved to prevent the US from overflying Spain with nuclear weapons. Simo Orts later appeared in court in New York claiming customary salvage rights of 1% of the bomb's $2 billion value, or $20 million. The matter was settled out of court. Compare this to Spectre wanting $280 million for 2 just 1 year later, which makes it look like Blofeld was offering a real bargain, or possibly serves as a salutary lesson in why you don't steal things you cannot possibly fence. January 1968. Thule Air Force Base, Greenland. This was a Chrome Dome mission, but was also combined with monitoring the US missile early warning radar in the area, so as to be able to verify what was going on if it went offline, as it was not terribly reliable, but also something the Soviets would try to take out first if they were launching an attack. A heating malfunction set fire to some seat cushions next to the air ducts, and there was a cabin fire the crew were unable to control, the craft losing electrical power and the smoke rendering it impossible to see the instruments. Waiting until directly over the base, 6 of the 7 crew members successfully got out and survived, albeit one of them had to spend 21 hours on an ice floe wrapped in his parachute before rescue. The 7th died after hitting his head on the way out. The stricken B-52 then began to come apart, before finally crashing onto sea ice in Westerholm Fjord, 7.5 miles north of the base. All 4 of the bombs had their HE detonate on impact. They considered just roping off the area and letting debris fall to the bottom in the spring when the ice melted, but the Danish government requested a full clean-up. which was of course January, so in the middle of the Arctic winter at minus 40 degrees, which is the point where Fahrenheit and Celsius are the same. Strong winds and with 24 hours of darkness. However, the clean-up mission had to be conducted there and then with some urgency to avoid material being dispersed in the spring when the ice melted. Initial work was to collect all the contaminated snow, water and ice in order to ship it back to the US during the summer. Overall, the effort took 700 people 9 months to complete. Only 3 of the 4 bombs were recovered, but the US did not admit this to the Danish government at the time. After Palomares, SAC had already scaled back airborne alert from 12 aircraft in the air at one time to 4. But this was the last straw for Chrome Dome and airborne alert in general. The accident rate was too high and had been a matter of concern even in the JFK administration at the start of the decade. The political costs were becoming very high, and further the financial costs involved were astronomical at a time the US was involved in a real war in Vietnam. In fact, only the US had the airframes, fuel and crews to maintain this sort of effort, which is why no one else has lost weapons in such a manner so far as we know. Also, technology had moved on. The bomber was no longer the primary means of nuclear delivery, as land-based missiles finally developed intercontinental range, and at least some sat in hardened silos to resist attack. And submarine-based missiles provided a mobile and strategically undetectable ability to retaliate against an aggressor. The US has not lost a weapon in an air crash since, and so from here until the end of the Cold War, it will be the Soviet Navy that would take over from the US Air Force as the service that was losing nuclear weapons. The big tech race, that everyone remembers from the 50s and 60s, was the space race, but submarines were a lesser-known frontier. Submarines up to the near end of World War II have been obliged to spend most of their time on the surface because of their diesel engines and very limited battery power for underwater propulsion. There were some experiments with bigger batteries, snorkels, and air-independent propulsion involving distressingly unstable rocket fuels. However, it was nuclear power that enabled submarines to stay underwater for months at a time. 1958 saw the US send Nautilus, transition the Arctic ice via the North Pole in what was intended as a direct retort to Sputnik. 1960 had USS Triton carry out the first submerged circumnavigation, and in 1966 the Soviets conducted a similar operation. Not a true circumnavigation, deploying from the Kola Peninsula to northwest Russia to Kamchatka in the east by going around South America. That said, the first loss of nuclear weapons would not involve a nuclear-powered submarine, but a conventional diesel-electric machine with nuclear missiles aboard. In March-April 1968, the US noted unusual Soviet Navy activity in the Northwest Pacific, and decided that this was consistent with looking for a missing submarine. The Soviets did not find anything and eventually gave up their search. However, the US kept looking, and in this they had a priceless advantage over the Soviets. SOSUS. This was a very highly classified set of hydrophones that were used to monitor the world's oceans, and after checking their recordings, they found a likely event. A single sound of either an explosion or implosion on March the 8th, and with triangulation, they were able to narrow their location down to somewhere that happened to be hundreds of miles from where the Soviets had been looking. They sent the Special Operations Sub, USS Halibut, to check that location out, and there they found the Soviet Project 629, NATO Gulf, class ballistic missile submarine K-129 at a depth of 16,000 feet. This was a potential intelligence goldmine, the opportunity to examine a Soviet submarine without the Soviets knowing about it, with just the slight problem that it was under 1,600 feet of water. So the CIA contacted Howard Hughes, who was your go-to guy for eccentric billionaire at the time. He set up a front company to build a ship with a gigantic claw hanging from it called the Glomar Explorer, like a floating skill tester machine. We have been legally advised one should not call them skill tester machines because there's no skill involved. They are going to charge. The cover was that they were going to mine the seafloor for manganese noodles, which were in increasing demand at the time as a raw material for the expanding Japanese comics industry. No, they were not, but I'm not going to go into that. You go spelunk that wiki hole in your own time and at your own risk. The wreck had broken in two, so they targeted the larger two-thirds. They did get a hold of this and began to raise it, but claws fractured and they lost most of it. If they'd been more savvy, they should have known that these things almost never let you get the prize on the first try. But I guess their black budget didn't have enough quarters in it for them to try again right away, or possibly their mum called them away before they were done, or George Harrison was distracting them by singing in the background. The bit they did get or at least admitted to getting, contained 2 nuclear torpedoes and the highly radioactive bodies of 6 crewmen who were subsequently buried at sea. This means that the 3 missile weapons aboard are still missing. Conspiracy theories abound about this, that the CIA got more of it than they admitted, about why K-129 was not where the Soviets had looked for it, and how it sank. The official Soviet hypothesis is that the boat got too steep while snorkeling, and with nearly half the crew on their first deployment could not resolve the situation in time. But unofficially, they've also blamed the collision with the USS Swordfish, although the US have denied this. And I should mention that this is their go-to excuse whenever they lose a sub. One could catch fire on the stocks in Gorky and they'd still blame it on a collision. The US had lost a nuclear-powered submarine before, the Thresher, but while she was a testbed for the 250-kiloton nuclear anti-submarine rocket Subrock, she was not carrying any when she lost reactor power and fell below her crush jet and imploded in 1963. Scorpion went missing in the Atlantic in May 1968, when SOSUS picked up the sounds of her implosion, and she was finally located in October by the survey ship Mizar in 10,000 feet of water, 400 miles southwest of the Azores. No cause for her loss, and the deaths of the 99 crewmen aboard has been definitively determined. Theories include a malfunctioning torpedo, a malfunctioning trash disposal that allowed water into the boat, and or a battery explosion. And there are the conspiracy theories, not least because 1968 was a really bad year for submarine accidents, the Israeli Dakar and the French Minerve also disappearing without trace. In any case, the 2 nuclear-tipped Mark 45 torpedoes have not been recovered. After the loss of Thresher, the USN has begun its subsafe program to thoroughly quality control its submarines. They have not caught up all the remedial work on Scorpion, which may have contributed to her loss, but they've never lost a submarine since, because there is room aboard a submarine for everything except a mistake. And your mum. The Soviet Union, well, if their mum doesn't fit on a sub, they can just open her up and find a smaller one inside, and if that one doesn't fit, just keep going until they get to one that does. As for the Soviets were frequently pushing their technological limits to compete with the West. Their navy lacked the political clout to refuse rushed equipment handed over in Q4 of each year to meet quotas. There was a disconnect between their operations and engineering branches, and their crews contained large contingents of short-term conscripts, which is less than ideal in a very highly technical branch. Against that, Soviet engineers built in plenty of redundant systems like dual hulls and duplicate reactors. Their designs had far more reserve buoyancy than Western designs, and sometimes incorporated dedicated escape pods. They also had heavier compartmentalization than US subs, with an explicit design goal that they should be able to make the service with one of them fully flooded. It is perhaps relevant to note that in all the incidents mentioned below, the Soviets did not lose a nuclear submarine at depth. They were always able to get to the surface. They didn't always necessarily get to stay there very long, but they would get there. So it might be fair to say that a Soviet submarine was more likely to have a serious problem than a US one, but it was also much more likely to survive one. April 1970, Bay of Biscay. A Project 627 Kit, or NATO November class, attack submarine K8 suffered short circuits and fires in 2 compartments at 400 feet depth. She successfully surfaced, but both reactors had to be shut down. The crew began to evacuate, but stopped once the towing effort began and they attempted to salvage the vessel. 8 had already died and compartments were sealed to prevent further damage. She finally sank during heavy weather 260 miles northwest of Spain in 15,000 feet of water, with a total loss of 52 men through flooding and carbon monoxide poisoning. 4 nuclear torpedoes were aboard when she sank. September 1977, Soviet Far East off Kamchatka. Project 667 Murena, NATO Delta class, SSBN K171, suffered a build-up of air pressure inside, causing one of the R-29 Vyosta missiles aboard to leak from its fuel tank. The missile compartment began to fill with puffs of smoke, and the decision was taken to relieve the pressure by opening the missile tube lid. This did relieve the pressure, but the rush of air blew the quarter-megaton warhead off the missile into the air and overboard. After research, the warhead was recovered intact, and as even the Soviet Navy would have been stretching credibility to blame the Americans, they blamed the lieutenant in charge of the missile control room. September 1980, Damascus. Arkansas. Love doing that. A Titan II missile was undergoing maintenance when one of the techs dropped an 8-kilo socket from a tool he was not supposed to be using. It fell about 80 feet before bouncing off a thruster and rupturing a first-stage fuel tank. This contained Aerosine 50, which is an equal split of normal hydrazine and UDM8. The most immediate problem was that this created a cloud of highly flammable vapours. The less immediate but more serious problem was that the structural integrity of the rocket required that fuel tank to have fuel in it. In the same way that you can't crush a full drink can, but you can an empty one, without fuel inside that tank, the rocket could not support the weight of the other fuel tanks atop it, nor the 9 megaton warhead. Yes, and the other fuel component was dinitrogen tetroxide, which in combination with aerosine is hypergolic, which means the two will ignite on contact without needing an ignition source. The complex was evacuated, and a few hours later personnel returned to take some measurements. Unfortunately, soon afterwards the missile exploded. The explosion blew off the 740-ton silo door and blew out the second stage of the missile, which in turn promptly caught fire. The warhead landed safely about 100 feet from the entry gate. The complex was entirely destroyed, and one airman later died of his injuries. The missile, serial number 620006, had previously been involved in a lethal fire that suffocated 52 of 55 civilian workers, upgrading the silo, and drowned another in hydraulic fluid in 1965. The warhead had been removed. The launch complex, 374-7, had previously been involved in an oxidizer leak in 1978, that sent a cloud of toxic fumes over a nearby highway and hospitalized nearby residents. June 1983. Saralanya Bay, Soviet Far East. This is the one exception to my list, where Soviet nuclear subs developed problems at depth but were able to get to the surface. This one was sunk from periscope depth by poor crew resource management. Project 670 SCAT, NATO Charlie 1 class, K429, was in port for an overhaul and refit when ordered to sail for an exercise. Captain Suvorov protested, but was ordered to go ahead, being obliged to assemble a scratch crew in part made up from sailors at the base and 5 other subs in port, so that nearly a third had never been aboard before. Despite being ordered to proceed directly to the exercise, Suvorov insisted on doing a test drive first, as per its standard operating practice. It was just as well that he did, although he then did not stick to procedure when carrying out the test dive. This was bad for 2 reasons. Firstly, if a large chunk of your crew do not know what they are doing, they are never going to learn how to do it properly unless you do it properly. Secondly, that puts a very heavy burden on your trained crew members. So the boat began to dive without the crew at proper stations and without calibrating their instruments. As a result, she ended up taking on way too much ballast and plunged to the seabed 39 meters down. Worse, her ventilation system had been set to the maximum possible to prevent welding fumes during the refits, and the safety interlocks had been disabled. So the forward compartments of the boat flooded, killing 14 men straight away. Bad as this was, Suvorov's insistence on a test dive had saved the rest of the crew. Otherwise they would have had this happen on the test range where the water was much deeper. Unfortunately, the emergency buoys and evacuation chambers had been welded to the hull. Therefore, 2 crew members had to make a free ascent from the torpedo room and struggled to shore where they were arrested. Rescue ships were dispatched and all but 2 of the remaining crew successfully ascended. K429 will have had 2 nuclear torpedoes on board at the time, which were recovered when the submarine was later raised. Captain Suvorov was sentenced to 10 years in prison. The admiral who ordered him to sea was promoted. October 1986, North Atlantic, 480 miles east of Bermuda. Project 667A Navaga, NATO Yankee class, SSBN K219, experienced a problem when seawater leaked through the plug into one of her missile tubes and began reacting with the fuel within, producing chlorine, nitrogen dioxide, and heat, which threatened to make this reaction even faster. The sub ascended to 50-meter depth and began damage control, but soon after an explosion breached the hull. The sub sank down to 300 meters before being stabilized. 3 men died as a result of the explosion. Another was lost after volunteering to go and manually shut down the reactors before they melted down. He succeeded, but was unable to escape as air pressure from a fire prevented the hatches being opened. K219 surfaced on battery power but sank after 2 days in 18,000 feet of water whilst under tow from flooding. Sources differ on how many warheads were lost, as the missiles may have had 2 or 3 warheads each. Given that it had 16 launch tubes, I see 32 or 48, therefore quoted, but as one was already out of commission and welded shut after a previous similar but less drastic incident, that would give 30 to 45 sunk with her, along with 2 nuclear torpedoes. No charges were ultimately pressed against the captain, and the Soviet and Russian governments have unofficially claimed the collision with the USS Augusta was responsible, something Captain Igor Butanov and the USN both deny. April 1989, Barents Sea. K2178 Kosmolets, a unique submarine known to NATO as the Mike class and the USSR as Project 685 Plavnik. She was a test bed for new technology, but still a combat-capable sub. She was built of titanium, which is very difficult to work and has to be welded in an inert atmosphere, and she was designed to go down so deep that if she needed to blow her tanks in an emergency, she had to use chemical gas generation rather than compressed air. With all this, she holds the record for the deepest dive ever carried out by a combat submarine, when she probed all the way down to 1,027 meters in 1984, during which at least some of her picked crew wore helmets to avoid being killed or maimed by a popped bolt. Anyway, in April 1989, she was on patrol at least much more reasonable depth of 335 meters, about 100 miles southwest of Bear Island, which sounds like it should be near San Francisco, but is actually a real place off Norway. A seal on a high-pressure line failed and ignited waste oil in the 7th compartment. With the high-pressure air feeding the fire, automatic fire suppression failed, and the fire began spreading from compartment to compartment via the cable penetrations. She was able to blow tanks and surface, but her nuclear power was shut down and she was functioning on the auxiliary diesel. They began to bring the fire under control, but the prolonged high temperatures caused the hull to breach and she began to sink. Her captain went back below to evacuate those crew who had not made it out when the order to abandon the ship was made, but became trapped inside as it sank near vertically. He got 4 others to the emergency escape pod, but could not get it to release. It was eventually blown free after an internal explosion in the doomed submarine as it plunged below 1,600 meters and rocketed to the surface so fast its hatches were damaged and it began taking on water. Only 1 of those 5 survived. Overall, 27 crew survived, 42 were lost. 2 nuclear torpedoes still lie at 5,500 feet. The British. The British have not lost one, Blofeld notwithstanding. Or at least they've never admitted it, and there is nothing in the available sources except one guy on WikiLeaks relating an alleged incident where he was told about but did not personally witness, where one of the Trident subs nearly went the way of Thresher. I like to think I'm better than using that. Not much better, but still. The Nuclear Information Service, who to be clear are not an agenda-free group because they openly state their objective in disarmament, list 110 British accidents, near misses and dangerous occurrences. They will not get listed here because a lot of them are outside the admittedly loose parameters I've set myself. 14 are related to manufacture, 21 are security incidents where someone got access to somewhere or some information they were not supposed to, 45 relate to incidents on nuclear-capable ships, aircraft or submarines. Not considering those. If I count those, I have to count every time the USS Forrestal caught fire. And that happens so many times they called it the USS Zippo or the USS Forest Fire. And as tech progresses, weapons get really small, and a lot of things are nuclear capable, including the Citroen 2CV. We'll get to that. 8 incidents during storage, including when they were dropped. I'm making a shocked face for those of you just listening with this tabbed out to something else. This is the stuff in American reports I scroll past because page after page of "the bomb dropped 2 inches because someone used the wrong spanner" does not make good material. Though occasionally I find stuff like this. Incident 8. In preparation for movement to a storage area. No, I will not do the accent. When the tractor moved forward, the semi-trailer disengaged and the outrigger wheels retracted, permitting the forward portion of the trailer to drop to the ground. It was estimated the warhead sections on the front of the trailer dropped a vertical distance of 18 inches, while the warhead sections on the wheel portion of the trailer dropped a distance of approximately 5 inches. To prevent a recurrence of similar incidents, it is recommended that A. An officer or non-commissioned officer supervise all handling and movement of atomic weapons. B. All drivers be made completely familiar with procedures and responsibilities involved with the operation of equipment used in the movement of atomic weapons. So, what was your policy before that? because this is during the draft. So, not supervised by officers or NCOs means leaving teenagers to do this by themselves. And if you go, well, people mature fast in military service, well, that might be true, but still, there is the proverb that if you leave a soldier alone with an anvil in a desert and tell him not to touch it, you will come back to find a broken anvil and a soldier who will swear blind that it just came apart in his hands. Oh yeah, going back. 22, involving road transport, including accidents, breakdowns, and vehicles overturning. Most of those later 30 are below my threshold of interest, because when your attention-grabbing case study is a truck came off a narrow icy road when the verge gave way and slid 3 feet into the field below, yeah, and very, very few involve anything coming close to weapons being lost in either, well, we don't know where it is, or it got destroyed sense. However, 1982, Falklands. One of the most important conflicts of the second half of the 20th century, and quite possibly the war with the largest consequences in all of human history relative to the utter inconsequence of the point at issue. Yeah, I'll justify that some other time. Anyway, part of the Royal Naval Force was sent to the South Atlantic, had just finished exercise Spring Train. So called because it was a training exercise taking place in the spring, and I guess because of defence cuts they could not afford a code name. As this was a NATO deployment, there would have been some air-dropped nuclear bombs for the Harriers and some nuclear depth bombs for the surface vessels. And if you are wondering why there are nuclear depth bombs, it's because the fundamental design of the depth charge has not changed since World War I. It is basically a barrel filled with explosives set to explode once it sinks to a given depth. These were barely adequate against World War II submarines because they travel at the speed of sink, and their effective radius is only about 10 metres. So it was quite possible for submarines to take evasive action at the stately few knots they could manage underwater. U-247, for example, was on the receiving end of at least 260 depth charges in April 1945, but still survived to return to base, presumably with no more ibuprofen or intact crockery aboard. More modern submarines are deeper diving, and nuclear submarines are capable of 30 knots plus, making conventional depth charges essentially worthless. Hence, the nuclear depth bomb for when you are not messing around. It is also fair to mention that the stakes are a lot higher in a potential World War III scenario, because if a sub escapes attack in World War II, worst case is it might attack a convoy later. If a sub escapes attack in World War III, the worst case is it gets to launch its missiles and you find yourself down a city or three. So the senior service was carrying these things around because they were expecting to be fighting to keep the Atlantic free from Soviet submarines, and not liberating windswept grassy islands of sheep and penguins at the arse end of the world that could only be of interest to depraved sex tourists and a junta of bargain basement Mussolini wannabes needing instruction from their own brutality and ineptitude. None of these weapons were ever intended to be used in that conflict, and supposedly all of them were removed before entering the combat zone, not least because that would have been a violation of the South American nuclear-free zone established in the Treaty of Tlatelolco. In 2005, the Blair government released a report that confirmed that 2/3 of the UK stock of nuclear depth bombs had gone to the South Atlantic, mostly consolidated in storage aboard the carriers Hermes and Invincible, and shuffled between the rest whenever one had to enter territorial waters to avoid breaching the treaty. However, there is still some talk, and we are here firmly where those who talk don't know, and those who know don't talk, that both Coventry and Sheffield still had some depth bombs aboard when they went down. Coventry sank in 100 metres of water, and was subsequently visited by Navy divers to remove sensitive and classified items. So if there are any aboard, they've either been removed or they were utterly inaccessible. Sheffield sits in 1,000 fathoms of water, which is way beyond driving depth, and so has not been visited to that extent. Though, as the Glomar Explorer has demonstrated, if you really want to get something up from that sort of depth, you can, if you have enough patience and spare change. You can go check for yourself. You would be desecrating a war grave. But I think if you're going to a remote part of the South Atlantic to dive to 6,000 feet just to satisfy your curiosity and or steal nuclear weapons, I don't think that's going to stop you. It hasn't stopped shallower wrecks from World War II being damaged, or in some cases entirely disappearing at the hands of presumed scrap metal dealers, presumably not named Constantino. The Chinese have never lost one. But this has to be treated with the caveat that on the one hand their arsenal is relatively small, and mostly uses land-based ballistic missiles that, unlike planes or subs, don't really go anywhere until you use them, and have a much, much lower accident rate. and also that they keep their cards so close to their chest they might as well be inside it. One is reduced to statements like, "A nuclear submarine that we are not sure was ever actually built might have had an accident of some kind." Or unsubstantiated allegations that in 1967, during the Cultural Revolution, the commander in Xiankang threatened to seize the nuclear base in his era if Maoists took over the provincial administration, which is both plausible and also something the Americans would make up to make the Chinese look bad and induce them to distrust their own military. Hello, cat. Am I talking about China? Okay, fine. The French. The French have never lost a nuclear weapon. There is that time they accidentally irradiated a bunch of their own VIPs during a test, and I had thought that was the same time an inadequately secured manhole cover may have been blown into space. But upon checking, that was a separate incident involving the Americans. Their most famous nuclear-related accident was in 1985, when they decided to respond to Greenpeace protesting their nuclear tests in the South Pacific in the level-headed and entirely reasonable manner of sending saboteurs to sink the Rainbow Warrior in Auckland Harbour. They did succeed in sinking the vessel in the harbour of a friendly nation, but New Zealand is basically Australia's Canada, so no one cares about upsetting them. However, they did accidentally kill someone in the process, and worst of all, got caught. For comparison, the equivalent Special Forces controversy in Britain at the time was the SAS shooting some IRA operatives in Gibraltar when they weren't actively engaged in planting a bomb and were not twirling their evil moustaches and gloating about how much they hated corgis and toad in the hole at the time. You see, this is why the French are pretty high on my do not mess with list, because they try things like this. On the other hand, they screwed up so badly, it's like finding out Dan Crenshaw lost his eye in a knife fight with Greta Thunberg. That doesn't count for our purposes, though, and it's not the one that should be famous, mind you, so let's talk about Green Gerbois. You like Gerbois? Don't know. Okay, fine. The first French nuclear test in Algeria, and you may be aware there was a little war of independence going on at the time. As in, Algeria is France's Vietnam. Of course, Vietnam was also France's Vietnam, but that was over by this point. Yeah, the French were ignominiously losing in Southeast Asia before it was cool. Also, the later war got to be soundtracked by the likes of CCR, the Doors, and the Stones. The French in Indochina had Maurice Chevalier and Charles Aznavour. Really, though, Algeria was worse because the American military never launched a coup to try to keep the war going. Oh, sorry, 2 coups. The first was in 1958 and brought de Gaulle back. But then 3 years later, they decided he was not showing the commitment to keeping Algeria French they wanted, and launched another to try to get rid of it. This one failed. These guys then went on a year later to shoot at least 187 times at him and miss before they deciding they should hire Edward Fox to do the job. Anyway, while this attempted coup was going on in the north of Algeria, where people actually live, down in the Sahara to the south, the French were getting ready to do another test. Paris wanted the test to go ahead in order to demonstrate that things were normal and under control. It was the early 60s, so their idea of rester calme et continuer could be detonate a nuclear weapon. It made sense at the time, as someone or other was letting one off twice a week back then. However, the coup plotters had already asked the testers to hold on to it, and the explosion was little more than a squib. So there is some evidence that the French military set off a nuclear device just to get rid of it before other elements of the French military could seize it to blackmail their own government with. This only becomes stronger when you read that the armed convoy used to take the device to the test site was an empty diversion because they didn't entirely trust the troops guarding it, and it was actually taken there in the back of someone's car. Remember that thing I said about Florida earlier? That might not be true. On the plus side, I did learn from this that a Citroen 2CV technically counts as a nuclear delivery platform. We've got to go raise this up. 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 It's down real deep. It's going to be difficult, and it's gonna take money, a whole lot of spending money. It's gonna take plenty of money to grab it, to raise it, to grab it, to grab it, to grab it, to raise it up.